Okay, so this is the first essential for this week, Essential 1. I can identify the side lengths of a square given its area. And then the other side of this is also I can find the area given its side lengths. So in other words, that we can go back and forth between the area of a square and the side lengths of a square. Okay, so here I just kind of have a generic square setup, right? Remember the area is like how much is in the inside. Like if I was going to color this whole thing in, right? It's the area is the amount of stuff on the inside. And we represent that with a unit squared symbol, right? Because it's two-dimensional. It has up and down and side to side, or we can call it length and width, right? It just means that it's two-dimensional, okay? So that's what that little squared up there means, that there's two dimensions to this thing. There's an up and down and a side to side aspect to it, okay? And then it also has these side lengths, right? And these are represented by just units, right? They're not squared. There's technically a little one up here, right? We don't technically write it, but it's just one dimensional. It just goes one way. In this case, this is my side to side measurement, okay? And since this is a square, it has the unique property that whatever the side to side length measure, this up and down one is going to be the exact same one. So that's going to be S units long. Okay. And I want to just kind of represent what does this look like without using these letters, because sometimes when we're using the variables or the letters, it gets a little bit confusing. So just as a concrete example, so if I had a square, all we're saying here is instead of having an S, that would just be a number. So just to pick an arbitrary or a random number, let's just use the number 5. Okay. And since I don't know if it's centimeters or inches or what the case is, we're just going to say it's 5 somethings. Those somethings we call units. So it's 5 units long. Okay. And just so what this is telling us is that this side to side, right, or this length or whatever we want to call it, right, is 5 units. Since it's a square, we know the up and down, right, or the width or whatever we want to call it, has to be the same measurement. That's how squares work. So we know this one is also 5 units. Okay. And then the area, the stuff that's inside this square, is the same as if we take the length times width, right? Sometimes they also call this the base times height, right? Just depends on what formula we're using, right? But it's the same thing, right? You take the one measurement multiplied by the other one gives you the area on the inside, okay? So how we represent this generically is that this area, since this is S and this is S, that's just S times S, or we can just write that as S squared, okay? So this is going to be S squared, or S times S units squared, okay? So in this case, on a more concrete example, right, I'm just going to take the 5 times 5. So again, that's going to be 5 times 5, or we can write that as 5 squared, right? But now that we're dealing with actual numbers, we can actually do this math, right? 5 times 5, or 5 squared, is 25. And again, we're going to mark these with just units squared. We're not going to deal with centimeters or inches, or we're just going to call them units, right? So it's 25 units squared, and that's the area on the inside. Okay. That's basically all we're going to be doing. We're going to be going back and forth between the area and side lengths. Okay. So we have 4 examples we're going to look at, right? And we're going to just apply this idea to these 4 examples. Okay. The reason we're going over this is we're going to be using this in our second essential for this week. And the second essential is actually the big idea. That's what we really care about. But we use this idea of squares to build the second essential. So this is actually building to the more important essential for this week. Okay, so if we look at this one, what this is telling me is that the area, or the stuff inside this square, is 42 units squared. Okay, So what we're going to do is we're going to practice using an equation to solve this, okay? Just because it's going to build into that second essential, okay? So what we're asked to do is if they give me the area, that means I'm going to want to find the side length. I'm just going to call it x because I don't know what it is right now. And that allows me to set up an equation. So if this side is x, we also know this side is x. So what the equation tells us is this times this, x times x, or x squared, equals the area, equals 42. And that gives me an equation I can solve, right? So here's how we handle these equations, and this is why we're setting up the equation so we can look at this idea. Remember, my goal in solving an equation is to get the x all by itself and all the numbers on the other side, right? So in this case, I want to get this x all by itself and all the numbers over here. Well, I have this number up here, right? We have this squared up here. So how do we get rid of a square is we do the opposite of squaring, right? And that's what we learned last week. The opposite of squaring is square rooting. So to get rid of or to undo this squaring, I'm going to square root. And remember, when we're dealing with equations, whatever we do to the one side of the equation, we do the same thing to the other side of the equation. Right? So here, this square and the square root, they cancel with each other. Those are gone. They're leaving me just the x. And then over here, we're just going to clean this up. So we're just going to find the square root of 42. Hopefully many of us realize that, are recognizing that that's not a perfect square. And so I'm just going to look on my sheet and I'm going to find the square root of 42. Remember, these get bigger as we go along. So I can see it's going to be bigger than 36, but not as big as the 49, right? It's somewhere in here is the square root of 42, which means the answer is somewhere in between 6 and 7. Okay, and again, we're just going to be estimating these to the closest thing. So we know it's going to be somewhere between 6 and 7. 42 is pretty close to the middle of these two things. I'm not going to get, we're just estimating, so I'm just going to say it's about the middle. So I'm going to say it's right halfway, or the middle of 6 and 7 is 6.5. So it's going to be 6.5. So x is 6.5, which means this side length is 6.5 units long. Okay, that's all we're doing in this stuff. Okay, so another real quick example. Okay, so I got the area is given to me as 25 units squared. So I'm just going to use x again, so that's going to be x times x, or x squared. It's going to equal 25. And then to solve this, we got to get that x all by itself. So to undo or to get rid of this 2, we're going to do the opposite, which is, so if this is squaring, the opposite is square rooting. So I'm going to square root both sides of the equation, right? This squared and square root, they cancel each other, leaving me just the x. And then on this side, right, we actually already did this one in our example, right? I can see it right here. The square root of 25 is 5. After last week, I think many of us are getting to the point where we're starting to recognize our perfect squared numbers, right? And this is one of those perfect squares. Again, if you didn't recognize it, that's fine. Hopefully you guys have made one of these answer sheets and you just come down and find it. And in this case, it's right in my list. So I can just read the answer off of the answer side is 5. Okay. So the other thing we're going to be asked is to go the other way. Oh, real quick before we move on, I did want to point out, I realized some of us probably seen, especially this one, right off the bat and was able to say, hey, if the area is 25, that the side length is 5. That's awesome. That's really going to help us out when we look at the next essential, right? And you're like, I don't need to set up this equation. And that's totally fine. right? We don't have to set up these equations. The reason I'm showing it in this equation is it's going to be a little bit helpful because we have to know how to solve equations using these squares and square roots. So that's why I'm kind of emphasizing this. But if you could just jump from here right to here, that's totally fine. Okay, next one. So this one, you can see they're giving me the side length. So that means we're finding the area. We're finding this inside stuff. Okay, and so what we're going to do is if this is 4, we know this side over here is going to also be 4 units long. And to find the area, you just take this number times this number, or we square it, right? This one doesn't require an equation. It's just using that formula. So we're just taking 4 times 4, or 4 squared, and 4 squared is 16 units squared. Right? We've done this before, and squares are pretty simple. But again, we need to be able to go back and forth between side lengths and areas in the next essential. So that's why we're practicing it one more time. And then sometimes they're not super easy, right? Because it has these decimals. So what I would do in this case, to find the area, we're going to take 7 times 7, right? I'm sorry, 7.3 times 7.3, or we're going to take 7.3 squared. Either way, okay? What I would do is get out my calculator and just do that one, okay? Just grab your calculator. See how well it, there you go, that ain't too bad. Okay, on mine, it has a squared button, so I'm going to use it. You could just as easily write in 7.3 times 7.3, but I'm going to go 7.3 squared and hit enter, and I'm going to get 53.29. Okay, so that's what the area here is 53.29 units squared. Okay, so that's all we're going to be doing in this section, is either going from the areas to the side lengths or from the side lengths to the area, back and forth. We're not going to be practicing this on Khan Academy. Here is your problem set or your practice set. See if I can get everything in the screen here. Just got it in there. Okay, so either pause the video and work from here, or whatever you want to do. I'll put the answer link on the website just like we did last week.